Ever find yourself like totally convinced about something and then bam, you realize you're like way off?
Or maybe you make a snap decision, then later you're like, what was I thinking?
Welcome to another episode of Books and Bites. It's like our brains are playing tricks on us, right? Those kind of sneaky mental hiccups that shape so much of what we do. That's exactly what we're diving into today.
Yeah. For this deep dive, based on the sources you gave me, we're going to unpack this super influential book by Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow.
You know from what you've read, this book is a total game changer when it comes to figuring out how our minds work.
And maybe even more important for our listeners is how our minds, sometimes lead us to make these predictable mistakes.
Right, and at the core of it all is this really cool concept of two different systems running the show in our heads.
Exactly. The book, as you've seen, presents this model where our minds use two main ways of processing information. System one, which is like that fast, gut feeling, kind of emotionally driven system.
And then there's system two, which is more like the slow and steady, logical, analytical one.
Exactly.
So our goal in this deep dive is to explore these two systems, figure out how they work together.
And really grasp how they affect every decision and judgment you make every single day.
So think of this as getting a backstage pass to the inner workings of your own mind, based on everything we've got here.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, let's break down these two systems. System one, like you said, is that super fast, intuitive part of our thinking. Always on, right?
Yeah, pretty much. System one works without you even realizing it. It's running on autopilot.
It just does its thing.
It's what lets you instantly recognize a face.
Yeah.
Or understand simple language. Or even pick up on those subtle changes in someone's tone when they're talking.
Gotcha.
It relies on intuition, those learned associations we build up over time, and those mental shortcuts we call heuristics. They're like rules of the thumb our brains use to make those split-second judgments.
So system one is the quick draw expert, and then system two steps in as the more thoughtful, analytical one.
Exactly. System two is the one you use for those brain-bending tasks that need your full attention. Like when you're solving a tricky problem or making a big decision where you've got to weigh all the options, or if you're trying to understand a complex report.
Right.
That's your system two at work, where your conscious reasoning and deliberate thinking comes in.
And from what I'm gathering, these two systems aren't just working in isolation. They're constantly chatting behind the scenes as you go about your day.
Totally. System one is constantly throwing out these initial impressions and gut feelings.
And then system two can jump in and be hold on a sec, let's think this through.
Exactly. It can evaluate those quick thoughts and maybe even correct them.
Sounds like a good system.
But here's the catch, and it's a big one. The book points out that system two, well, it's kind of lazy.
Lazy. Come on, system two, get it together.
I know, right? But thinking hard takes energy, so our brains tend to go with the easier route, accepting whatever system one throws out without really giving it a second thought.
Interesting. So it's all about conserving energy, even for our brains. The bat and ball problem in the book really shows this dynamic between the two systems. Can you walk us through that?
Okay, here's the problem. A bat and a ball cost $1.10 together. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. So how much does the ball cost? What popped into your head right away when you read this in the book?
I gotta be honest, my gut reaction was 10 cents. It just felt like the obvious answer.
And that's the classic system one response, the one most people go for. It's quick, it feels right, it's intuitive.
Makes sense.
But if you fire up system two and actually do the math, you'll see that if the ball costs 10 cents and the bat is $1 more, that puts the bat at $1.10. And if you add those together, you get $1.20 and not the $1.10 from the problem.
Right. So it's a bit of a trick question.
It is. The actual answer is that the ball costs 5 cents.
Yeah.
And the bat costs $1.05. This little puzzle perfectly shows how system one can zip to a plausible sounding answer, but it's wrong. And you need to kick system two into gear to catch that and find the right answer. It's a great example of how easily we can get tricked if we don't stop and think things through.
It's funny because even though I know the right answer now, that 10 cents still feels tempting. It really proves your point about how easily system one can lead us astray when system two is off taking a nap.
It really does.
And speaking of being active, the book also dives into the limits of system two. It's not like it's got unlimited power, does it?
Nope, it definitely doesn't. System two needs mental energy and focus to work, and we only have so much of that to go around. It's a limited resource.
I see, so it can get tired.
Yeah, you can think of it like a battery that drains. When system 2 is busy with something that demands a lot of attention, it's got less juice left over for other things like critical thinking or resisting that extra cookie.
So true.
It's something to remember when you're juggling a bunch of tasks that require you to really think.
Yeah, it's like when I'm totally swamped at work, all my good intentions about eating healthy just fly out the window. So tempting to reach for the sugary snacks.
I know exactly what you mean.
The book describes this experiment that really illustrates that, the cognitive load experiment. What exactly went down there?
Oh, right. In this experiment, people were asked to memorize a whole string of numbers, and at the same time, they were offered a choice between two snacks, a decadent chocolate cake and a healthy piece of food.
Tough choice.
It is, right? Especially when your brain is already working overtime.
Right.
The researchers found that people who were under that high cognitive load, trying to keep that long number in their heads, they were way more likely to choose the cake, that impulsive, less healthy option, compared to the people whose system 2 wasn't already overloaded. It shows that when our brains are preoccupied, we tend to just go with what system 1 wants, those immediate desirals, and we're less able to resist temptation or make those deliberate, healthier choices.
You've probably noticed this in your own life, like when you're mentally drained and you make those snap decisions you might end up regretting later.
Definitely.
When I'm tired, all bets are off.
So we've got this limited system 2 that's often overshadowed by a speedy, but sometimes not so reliable system 1. It's almost like we've got a lazy controller up in our heads, just like the book says.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, because mental effort, well, it feels like effort. We naturally try to avoid it whenever we can.
And go for the easy way out.
Exactly. We rely on routines, we go with the default options, and those effortless insights System 1 seems to offer. This laziness of System 2 is even more obvious in tests like the Cognitive Reflection Test, or CRT.
Which uses those quick problems designed to trigger that intuitive but incorrect answer, similar to the bat and ball one. People who are more inclined to use System 2, they're more likely to override that initial impulse and get to the right answer. It's basically a measure of how much we really like to think things through versus just going with our gut.
So it's like a test of how much we like to use our brains.
You could say that, yeah.
System 1 seems like it's always running in the background, making all these connections between things. The book calls it an associative machine. What's that all about?
It's like System 1 is this massive network connecting ideas, concepts, and all those experiences we've had. And when one thought pops up, it triggers a chain reaction of related thoughts and feelings.
It's like a domino effect.
Yeah, exactly. And it's actually really efficient for quickly making sense of the world around us and anticipating what might happen next.
That makes sense.
But there's a flip side. This associative machinery can sometimes lead to these weird and potentially misleading effects like priming, where being exposed to one thing, even subtly, can influence our thoughts or actions later on without us even realizing it.
Priming, I've heard of that. That's where like seeing a word or an image can influence what we do afterwards, even if we don't consciously make the connection, right?
Exactly. A classic example discussed in the book is the old word priming experiment. People were shown words related to old age, like wrinkled or gray, and guess what? They actually walked a little slower afterwards compared to people who weren't exposed to those words.
Wow, really?
Yeah, it's wild. And it happened unconsciously. They didn't even realize those words were affecting how they walked.
Subliminal messaging.
Kinda, yeah. It suggests that all these subtle cues in our environment are constantly nudging us in ways we don't even realize.
That's trippy.
Think about how the music playing in a store might affect your mood, and even what you buy. Or how the way a question is worded in a survey can subtly guide your answer. These are all examples of priming in action, messing with our minds without us knowing.
It makes you wonder about all the things that are shaping our thoughts and actions without us even being aware of it.
For sure.
The book also talks about this feeling of cognitive ease. How does that play into our judgments and what we believe?
Okay, cognitive ease is basically how easy or difficult it feels to process information. When things are familiar, clear, easy to understand, or when we've seen them over and over again, we feel this sense of cognitive ease. And this feeling often leads us to trust the information more, to feel like it's familiar, and even to believe it.
So if it's easy for our brains to process, we're more likely to believe it's true. Seems like that could be a problem.
Yeah, it definitely can be. For example, studies have found that stocks with easy-to-pronounce names actually tend to do better right after their first offer to the public. It's because that ease of processing the name makes a better first impression on investors.
Interesting.
But here's something even more concerning. The illusory truth effect. It basically says that repeating a false statement over and over again can actually make it feel more true over time, even if you knew it was false to begin with.
Really?
Yeah, and this is a huge deal, especially now when we're constantly bombarded with information from all sides. It's a big reason why it's so important to really engage System 2 and critically evaluate information, especially when it seems really familiar or straightforward.
So don't believe everything you hear, even if you hear it a lot.
Exactly.
Okay, we've talked about how these two systems work and how System 1 can sometimes lead us down the wrong path. This brings us to a big theme of the book, heuristics and biases. Those are the mental shortcuts System 1 relies on. They're efficient, but can also lead to some predictable errors in our judgment. Let's start with the law of small numbers. This isn't about regular math, right?
No, not really. The law of small numbers is about how we tend to overestimate how much small samples actually represent the bigger group they come from. We're pattern seekers by nature, so we try to draw big conclusions from just a little bit of data, even when it's probably just random chance.
That makes sense.
The book uses this great example about birth ratios in hospitals. Smaller hospitals, just because they have fewer births overall, are way more likely to have days where the ratio of boys to girls born is extreme, like maybe 70% boys. But in a large hospital with lots more births, these random swings tend to even out over time.
Right.
But we might look at that small hospital's data and think, wow, there must be something special going on there to cause that skewed ratio. But it's probably just random luck because of the small sample size.
Gotcha.
It's a good reminder to be careful about jumping to conclusions when you only have a little bit of information. Like, don't bet your life savings on a single poker hand.
Solid advice. So we're always looking for explanations, even when things might just be random. Another bias the book talks about is the anchoring effect. How does that mess with our judgments?
The anchoring effect is all about how much we rely on the first piece of information we get, even if it's totally irrelevant to the actual value. Like, imagine someone asks you if Gandhi was older than 114 when he died, and then asks you to guess his actual age.
Interesting.
People who get that initial high number tend to guess a much higher age than people who were first asked if he was older than 35. Even though both those starting numbers are way off, they still influence the final guess.
So even a random starting number can stick in our heads and influence our perception. That's crazy.
It's a powerful effect, and it pops up everywhere. In negotiations, when people are trying to figure out how much something is worth, in everyday estimations all over the place, it shows how easily that first piece of information we see, even if it's totally arbitrary, can skew how we think.
Makes sense. Then there's the availability heuristic, which I think has something to do with how easily we can remember certain things.
Spot on. The availability heuristic is all about judging how likely something is to happen based on how easily we can think of examples of it. Things that are vivid, dramatic, scary, or recent tend to pop into our minds more readily.
Makes sense.
This can make us overestimate the chances of things that are actually pretty rare, like plane crashes, because they're all over the news and we remember them vividly. And it can make us underestimate the risks of more common but less dramatic events, like car accidents.
Right, so our idea of risk can get really distorted by what we see in the news, or even just what we've experienced ourselves, even if it's not statistically accurate.
Exactly. What comes to mind easily isn't always the most accurate picture of reality. We have to remember that.
Important to keep in mind. And then there's the last one from this section on heuristics, the representativeness heuristic. Sounds like it's about making judgments based on stereotypes or how similar something seems to a category.
Yeah, the representativeness heuristic makes us judge the probability of something belonging to a category based on how well it fits the image we have of that category, even if we ignore important statistical information.
Okay, I'm following.
The classic Linda problem illustrates this perfectly. Imagine we're told Linda is single, outspoken, and passionate about social justice. Then we're asked if it's more likely that she's a bank teller, or a bank teller who's active in the feminist movement. Most people pick the second option because Linda's description seems to fit the stereotype of feminist activist.
Yeah, it does.
But logically, the probability of her being both a bank teller and a feminist is always lower than the probability of her just being a bank teller.
Right. There are more bank tellers in general.
Exactly. This heuristic can lead us astray by making us prioritize superficial similarity over actual probability. It's a reminder that our gut feelings about what fits a certain profile can be really misleading.
It's like our intuition overrides the facts.
Interesting. Now, the book also talks about overconfidence, something I think we've all experienced at some point. You mentioned the illusion of understanding. What's that all about?
The illusion of understanding is basically our tendency to think we understand the world, especially the past, way better than we actually do. We create these neat and tidy stories and explanations for events after they've happened, which gives us this false sense that we could have predicted it all along.
Hindsight is 20/20.
Exactly. And it's closely tied to hindsight bias, where we look back and say, oh, that was so obvious, I should have seen it coming. The problem is, this hindsight makes us overestimate how well we actually could have predicted it. Like, after a big stock market crash, it's easy to look back and point to all the factors that led to it. But that doesn't mean anyone could have accurately predicted it beforehand.
Right.
This illusion can lead us to be way too confident about our ability to predict the future. So we basically rewrite history to make it seem more predictable than it really was. And that makes us think we've got a better grasp on what's going to happen next.
Gotcha. The book also talks about the illusion of validity, particularly when it comes to experts making predictions.
Yeah, the illusion of validity is this unwarranted faith in our own predictions, especially when they're based on what seems like a consistent pattern of information. Experts in fields where there's a lot of uncertainty, like stock market analysts or political forecasters, they can be especially susceptible to this.
Makes sense.
Even if their track record isn't that great, if they can tell a good story and sound confident, both they and the people listening to them might overestimate their actual ability to predict what's going to happen.
Interesting.
The key is to know the difference between areas where skill and patterns lead to predictable outcomes and areas where random chance and unpredictable factors play a bigger role. In those uncertain environments, even expert intuition can be wrong, and being overconfident can be really misleading. That's a good point. We often put a lot of trust in expert opinions, so it's important to be aware of that. And then there's the planning fallacy, which I'm pretty sure everyone's experienced at some point, especially when working on projects.
Yeah, the planning fallacy is our tendency to underestimate how much time, money, and effort a project will take, while also overestimating the benefits.
Yeah.
We tend to focus on the best-case scenario and forget about all the times similar projects have gone over budget or taken way longer than we thought.
Oh, for sure.
The classic example is the Sydney Opera House. It took much longer and cost way more than anyone initially thought. And we see this play out in our own lives all the time, whether it's renovating a house or even just trying to get something done at work. We're just naturally optimistic about our abilities and don't always account for those unexpected hiccups along the way.
It's like we always think we can do it faster and cheaper than we actually can. Now, the book takes a really interesting turn when it starts talking about how we make decisions under uncertainty through the lens of prospect theory. This is a different approach than traditional economic models that assume people are perfectly rational, right?
Absolutely. Prospect theory, which earned Kahneman a Nobel Prize, looks at how people actually make choices when there's risk and uncertainty. And it often shows that we don't behave as rationally as those economic models predict. One of the core ideas of prospect theory is that we don't evaluate outcomes based on their absolute value, but rather in terms of gains and losses compared to where we are right now.
Okay, I'm listening.
And that reference point is key because it shapes how we see and react to potential changes.
And this focus on gains and losses rather than absolute value leads to some really interesting psychological effects like loss aversion, which seems to have a big influence on our choices.
Yeah, loss aversion is huge. It's the idea that the pain of losing something feels way stronger than the pleasure of gaining the same amount.
Interesting.
Studies have shown that on average, losing, say, $100 hurts about twice as much as gaining $100 feels good.
So the pain of a loss is stronger than the joy of a gain.
Exactly. And this has a huge impact on how we make decisions. It makes us more cautious about taking risks when we might lose something, and sometimes even pushes us to take bigger risks just to avoid a loss.
That explains why people might hold on to a bad investment for too long, just hoping to avoid taking that loss. And this ties into the endowment effect, doesn't it?
Yep, the endowment effect is basically the idea that we tend to overvalue things just because we own them. Once we have something, we want way more money to give it up than we'd be willing to pay to get it if we didn't already have it.
So it becomes more valuable to us just because it's ours.
Exactly. The classic mug experiment demonstrates this perfectly. People who were given a mug asked for much more money to sell it than people who didn't have a mug were willing to pay to buy one.
It's like ownership creates this special attachment that inflates the value in our minds.
Totally. And then there's the sunk cost fallacy, which is kind of like loss aversion, but it's more about how we cling to past investments.
Right.
The sunk cost fallacy is when we keep pouring time, money, or effort into something just because we've already invested a lot, even when it's clear it's not the best path forward anymore.
It's like throwing good money after bad.
Yeah, exactly. We feel this pressure to try to recover what we've already put in, even if it means risking even more losses. Like staying in a movie you hate just because you already bought the ticket. Logically, that money is gone, and you should just decide whether you want to keep watching based on if you're enjoying it. But we often feel this need to avoid admitting we made a mistake and wasted our time or money.
Makes sense. It's that feeling of, I've come this far, I can't quit now.
Right. Even when quitting would be the smarter choice. And lastly, the book emphasizes the power of framing when it comes to prospect theory. How can the way information is presented change our decisions so much?
Yeah, that's always fascinating to me.
Framing is basically how the choices or information are presented to us. Little tweaks in wording, emphasis, or context can totally change what we choose, even if the facts are the same. Like, imagine a medical treatment being described as having a 90% survival rate versus a 10% mortality rate.
Huge difference.
It is, right. People are way more likely to choose the treatment when it's framed in terms of survival, even though it's the exact same treatment.
Yeah.
It shows how easily our decisions can be swayed by how things are presented, even if the data is identical. It's super important to look beyond the surface and understand the underlying information to make a good decision.
It's like marketing 101, spin it the right way, and people will buy it.
Exactly. Be aware of how information is being presented and try to see past the framing to the real facts.
Solid advice. Now, the book wraps up with a really interesting discussion about our two selves, the experiencing self and the remembering self. What's the main difference between these two?
Okay, so we live our lives moment to moment.
Right.
And how we feel in each of those moments, that defines our experiencing self. This self is all about those immediate feelings, pleasure, pain, joy, sadness as they're happening.
Gotcha.
The remembering self, on the other hand, is the part of us that looks back on those experiences and judges them.
Right.
But here's the catch. The remembering self doesn't have a perfect memory of every single moment. It's heavily influenced by the most intense moments and how the experience ended, and it often doesn't give as much weight to how long the experience actually lasted.
That's interesting.
The book uses this example about people's preferences for colonoscopies, which is, well, not the most pleasant experience, but it illustrates this difference really well.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Some patients who had longer colonoscopies with more discomfort spread out over time actually rated the experience as less negative overall than patients who had shorter procedures, but with more intense pain that ended abruptly.
Wow.
Yeah, it's because the remembering self tended to prefer the experience that ended with a gradual decrease in pain, even though the total amount of discomfort was greater over the longer period.
Interesting.
That ending had a bigger impact on how they remembered and judged the experience.
So it's not necessarily about maximizing pleasure every single second. It's about how we remember the experience as a whole. It's a wild concept. How does this all connect to our overall happiness and life satisfaction?
Our remembering self plays a big role in how we evaluate our lives and how satisfied we are overall. But Kahneman talks about the focusing illusion, which suggests that when we think about specific things that we think will make us happy, like more money or moving to a new place, we tend to overestimate how much they'll actually affect our long-term happiness.
So we might be chasing the wrong things.
Yeah, it's like people often think that moving to California will make them way happier. And while the weather might contribute to those moment-to-moment pleasures for the experiencing self, the remembering self, when asked about overall life satisfaction, is more influenced by bigger, more stable factors like relationships, job satisfaction, those kind of things that aren't just determined by location.
So it's about looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly. The focusing illusion highlights how we tend to put too much emphasis on whatever we're currently thinking about, while underestimating how much other, more consistent parts of our lives actually affect our well-being.
That's a good point. So as we wrap up this deep dive into thinking fast and slow, based on all the great sources you shared, what are the most important things you want our listeners to walk away with?
Based on everything we've covered, here are the key takeaways. First, realize that System 1, that fast, intuitive part of your thinking, has way more influence on your judgments and decisions than you might realize. Second, remember that System 2, that slower, more deliberate thinker, is often a bit lazy, and that makes you more vulnerable to those cognitive biases.
Gotcha.
Third, really pay attention to those biases, like anchoring, availability, and loss aversion, because they can lead you to make irrational choices in all sorts of situations. Fourth, Keep in mind that your remembering self, the one that looks back and judges your past experiences, often creates a story that doesn't perfectly reflect what you actually experience moment to moment.
Right.
And that affects how you see those events and how satisfied you are with your life overall.
It's all about perspective.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, the most important thing is that by understanding these biases and how those two systems of thought work, you can become more aware of your own potential to be irrational and hopefully make better, more informed decisions in every aspect of your life.
Those are really helpful insights. And the book is packed with so many thought-provoking quotes. Are there any that stand out to you?
Definitely. One that really sticks with me and that I think applies to so many situations is, nothing in life is as important as you think it is while you are thinking about it. It's a great reminder to keep things in perspective and not get too fixated on one single thing.
It's like, don't sweat the small stuff.
Exactly. And another one that's really relevant today with all the information overload we face is, a reliable way to make people believe falsehoods is frequent repetition. It highlights how powerful those effects of cognitive ease and the illusory truth effect are on what we believe.
Really powerful stuff. Kahneman's work has had a huge and lasting impact on how we understand human behavior and decision-making. It's influenced so many fields, from psychology and economics to marketing and even public policy.
It has. It really makes us question that idea that we're always perfectly rational.
Right. It challenges our assumptions.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we have these built-in cognitive limitations and then learning how to work with them.
So for everyone listening, think about the last big decision you made. Looking back at it through the lens of these two systems and all the biases we've talked about, do you see it any differently now?
What would you do differently in the future?
It's definitely something to think about. If you want to learn more about these fascinating and incredibly useful ideas, be sure to grab a copy of the book from the link in the description.
And subscribe to Books and Bites.